Hi, I'm Professor Graeme Yorston, and today I'm at the Holocaust Memorial in London. I'm going to be talking about one of the darkest chapters in human history, the extermination of 300,000 children and adults by the Nazi regime in Germany. The programme has come to be known as Action T4, or Aktion T4 in German, after the address of the department administering the killings, Tiergartenstraße 4, a place where unspeakable horrors were planned and organised, now transformed into the iconic Berlin Philharmonic Hall. This terrible persecution of the most vulnerable and powerless members of German society began just a few months after Hitler came to power in 1933, with the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring, enforcing compulsory sterilisation on those diagnosed with genetic conditions, as well as alcoholism and what were deemed to be other forms of social deviance, including homosexuality, prostitution and vagrancy. Over 200 special hereditary health courts were set up to decide who should be sterilised, each made up of 2 doctors and a district judge. The commonest grounds for sterilisation were feeble-mindedness, schizophrenia, epilepsy, manic depression, hereditary deafness or blindness. Even a cleft palate was enough to mark you out. Psychiatric hospitals, special schools, prisons and nursing homes were searched for people they considered to be Untermenschen, or subhuman. Most often, tubal ligation was carried out in women and vasectomy in men, but full hysterectomies and radiation sterilizations by means of radium or X-rays were also performed. Around 360,000 people were sterilized between 1933 and 1939, and of these, 7,000, most of them women, died as a result of the surgery. You might think that the regime would have wanted to keep this radical sterilisation programme quiet, but quite the reverse. It was launched amid a blaze of publicity as racial hygiene was a key component of Hitler's plans. There was little opposition from the medical profession. Some women got pregnant in the hope of escaping sterilisation, so the state soon extended the law to authorise abortions plus sterilisation for eugenic reasons. As shocking as this may sound, the practice was actually widespread in many US states long before it was started in Germany, with over 60,000 sterilizations performed, mostly in liberal California. Other countries with similar policies were Canada, Switzerland, all of Scandinavia. If anything, Germany was rather slow in joining in. Consider this newspaper leading article from the 21st of December 1933. 400,000 Germans are to be sterilised. The programme will save the national economy the enormous cost of providing futile care for hereditary diseases. In no country of the world is eugenics more active as an applied science than in Germany, the first of the great nations to make direct practical use of eugenics. Was this some extremist Nazi propaganda rag? No, sadly not. It was the New York Times, 4 days before Christmas. Goodwill to all men? I think not. Britain was one of the few Northern European countries that did not introduce forced sterilisation, despite Brits being the main instigators of the mental hygiene or eugenics movement. The term was coined in 1883 by Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, who suggested that eugenics would enhance the further evolution of the human race. These ideas gradually evolved into a more ominous social movement aimed at reducing the proportion of people with lesser genetic endowments and became inextricably bound up with ideas about racial and class supremacy. Eugenics journals were published, and many universities established eugenics departments. Respectable doctors were happy to have their names publicly associated with research on forced sterilisation and discussions about setting up a national lethal chamber. Back in Germany, the furious pace of rearmament in preparation for war led to a labour shortage in 1937, which meant that anyone capable of working was deemed useful, so they were exempted from the law and the rate of sterilisation declined. Only to be replaced by something far, far worse. Gerhart Krechmar, a farm labourer, and his wife had a son, Gerhart, who was born blind, with no legs and only one arm. His parents took him to see Dr. Werner Cattell, a paediatrician at the University Children's Clinic in Leipzig, and asked for him to be put to sleep. The doctor told them this was illegal, so they wrote directly to Hitler, asking that he overrule the law that prevented this monster, as they described their own child, from being killed. Hitler summoned Karl Brandt, one of his personal physicians, and sent him to Leipzig to arrange the killing in July 1939. The register of the pretty village church where he is buried states that Gerhart Krechmar died of heart weakness. In reality, he was given a lethal injection, probably phenobarbital, which would have sent him quietly to sleep, and he would then have stopped breathing. Within weeks, Hitler demanded that a system be set up to deal with all similar cases, and the Reich Committee for the Scientific Registering of Hereditary and Congenital Diseases was established. Its aim was to identify all those who were considered life unworthy of life, lebensunwertes Lebens, a chilling phrase if ever there was one. Doctors and midwives were required to report all newborns with severe disabilities and all children under the age of 3 in which serious hereditary disease was suspected: Down syndrome, microcephaly, hydrocephaly, malformations of the limbs, head and spine, paralysis and muscular problems. Reports were prepared and reviewed by a panel of medical experts, 3 of whom were required to give their approval before a child could be killed. The ministry routinely lied to parents and guardians, particularly in Catholic areas where families tended to be less cooperative. They were told that their children were being sent to special sections where they would receive new treatments. But there was no treatment. They were kept for a few weeks and then killed by an injection of toxic chemicals, most commonly phenol, a caustic antiseptic that causes intensely painful cramps before death. The records were falsified to say that they died of pneumonia. The most notorious of these institutions was AMSpigelgrundt, a child mental health clinic in a suburb of Vienna, where from 1940 to 1945, 789 children were killed by lethal injection, gas poisoning, neglect and physical abuse. 789. It's hard to get your head around the numbers when thinking about the Holocaust. 789 is just a small fraction of the 6 million who died. But this was a hospital. It was meant to be for care and compassion, not cold-hearted murder. "789 killings over a 4-year period. That's almost one a day, assuming they took weekends off, of course." Autopsies were usually performed and samples taken for so-called medical research. In reality, many of the children's brains were simply dropped into jars of formaldehyde and stored away in the basement of the clinic, and in the case of Heinrich Gross, in his own private collection, which was only discovered in 2001. At the time, the killings were referred to as either euthanasia or Gnadentod, or merciful death, but there was no mercy at AMSpigelgrundt. Children were subjected to cruel punishments and torture that was pretending to be treatment. This next section is particularly harrowing, so you may want to skip ahead. Survivors of this clinic testified in court to describe some of the treatments on offer. The cold water cure, in which children were repeatedly submerged in freezing cold water until they were blue and barely conscious and had lost control of their bowels. the sulfur cure, an injection that caused severe pain in the legs, limiting mobility and ensuring escape was impossible. Spinal injections of apomorphine, a drug that causes intense nausea and vomiting. Injections of phenobarbital and other sedatives, which often led to death as the children were starving and exposed to extreme cold. They were also infected with tuberculosis bacteria as human guinea pigs for the testing of vaccines. As the war progressed, less rigorous standards of assessment and a quicker approval process were adopted. Older children and adolescents were included, and the conditions subject to the programme were expanded to encompass children with much milder intellectual impairments and juvenile delinquents. Greater pressure was applied to parents to agree to their children being sent away. Many parents suspected what was happening and refused consent, but they were warned that they could lose custody of all of their children if they did not comply, and if that did not persuade them, they were threatened with being called up for so-called labour duty. With the early successes of the German army came ever-expanding territories, so the Nazi regime had to find more efficient ways of killing people. Lethal injections and mass shootings were slow, expensive, and stressful to those carrying them out. So by June 1941, they had begun experimenting with carbon monoxide poisoning from the exhaust fumes of mobile gas fans as a new, cheaper method. Slightly later came Cyclone B, pesticide pellets that rapidly vaporize in a warm room to release hydrogen cyanide gas. This soon became the method of choice at Auschwitz and other death camps. By 1941, over 5,000 children had been identified by the committee and murdered, so the policy was extended to adults. Those chosen were taken on buses to euthanasia centres established at 6 existing psychiatric hospitals, where a sham medical examination would take place. Victims would then be sent for a shower, and as we now know, these were in fact gas chambers. Most were killed within 24 hours of arrival at the centres. Their families would then be sent a falsified death certificate along with an urn containing ash from a group cremation. Doctors were asked to select patients who were incurably sick. One of the ways this was determined in the case of schizophrenia was to try the new treatment of insulin shock therapy. If they didn't get better, Gnadentod. Around 300,000 were selected and killed. This is a picture of just one. Anna Leenkering was 24 when she died. She once dreamed of working in a nursery, but she was killed for being subhuman. Around 85% of all the patients in mental hospitals and care homes were killed in this way. Many, perhaps up to half, were taken from church-run asylums, usually with little protest or opposition from the administrators. There were those who spoke out against the killings, however. The Vatican announced on the 2nd of December 1940 that the policy was contrary to divine law, and Clemens van Galen, the Catholic Bishop of Münster, was put under virtual house arrest for the duration of the war because of his condemnation of the killing of the innocent and defenceless. By the end of 1941, 93,000 beds had been emptied, and Aktion T4 was officially stopped. The killings went on throughout the war, however, and the last child to be killed was on the 29th of May 1945 in the children's ward of a hospital in Bavaria, more than 3 weeks after the US Army occupied the town. But what of the doctors involved? Well, some were hanged, some killed themselves, but some flourished after the war. Heinrich Gross was director of the children's ward at AMSpigelgrundt from 1940. At least half of the 789 victims died under his care. He experimented on the living and removed his victims' brains after they were dead for his personal collection. After the war, he became a highly successful speaker, expert witness and researcher. He was given an honorary cross for science and art by the Austrian government in 1975. He published numerous medical articles in respected journals. Here are 2 of them from the 1950s. still available from academic libraries. This one describes a girl with a brain abnormality admitted to the hospital in 1943. It has a picture of her before her admission, a pretty 7-year-old in a white dress. It then has a picture of her brain removed after her death from what else but pneumonia. I didn't feel it was right to show these pictures, they're just too distressing. Gross was eventually investigated and stripped of his medal, but by the time his case came to court, he had dementia and was deemed unfit to stand trial. It is tempting to think of the Holocaust as a terrible wrong perpetrated by a few evil monsters, but I think this is too easy. For me, what is most chilling about this period of history is that it was not the work of a few, but the actions of many. Ordinary people, civilized people, cultured, hard-working, intelligent people, people with families and careers and pensions, just like you or me. People who are somehow corrupted to behave in an inhuman way. It's very uncomfortable to think how easy it was for decent people to become Hitler's willing executioners. Thank you for watching. This has been a hard video to do, and no doubt it's been hard to watch, but we really must never forget what happened.